Assalamu alaikum, Jazakallah. Thank you, Brother Munir. A famous person once said, if you don't know your history, you don't know where you're coming from. And this series is a very, very interesting series made from PBS, broadcast nationally, also available on the web, 6 episodes, which was produced this year, released this year, which tells how Muslims influenced America. And the fact that we don't know about our history, at least I didn't know, is sort of embarrassing, but also a source of pride when you learn more about our history, because we influenced the Constitution. Muslims fought in the Civil War, influenced laws in America, and this series goes into 6 different chapters of early Muslim life from 1700s to South Asians and how Southeast Asians and how we influenced American politics, to Black Muslims and how they influenced America and Civil War movement. So it's really interesting. We're going to watch the first series here, which is about the first mosque in America, first built mosque. And one thing interesting when I saw this was, note how the first Muslims, when a person was researching her history, she actually did not even know that her ancestors who built this mosque were Muslim. So this is a warning sign for us that, you know, if we don't instill our culture and religion into our generations, future generations might, God forbid, forget our religion. So that being said, let's watch the first series out of the 6-part series on the early Muslims in America. Thank you. It's so inspiring, and it draws so much strength to realize that we're not just what they said here. We're not just new immigrants. Most of us are, but Islam goes and Muslims go before this nation was even formed. And now we look at the first settlers here in the U.S. I'd love to hear any thoughts, if anyone has any reflections from what we saw. Anyone from the Syrian community is here? Do you want to say anything? Or yeah, I'd love to hear any stories if people can relate.
Okay, I'm Palestinian, and I heard about my grandfather. They said he went to Africa, to America, before they left Palestine. It means before 1948. Sometimes I think, no, they think that he went to America. Maybe they said he left and came back. Then I think, no, it is not true. Maybe he traveled to some other place and
The Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. is one of America's oldest federal institutions. Among its vast collections, many materials date back to our nation's founding. I've come here to see two books that offer very different views of the early United States and the place of Muslims within it. One book contains an English translation of the Quran, Islam's sacred text, and was once owned by Thomas Jefferson.
That's Jefferson's initial, a little T before the I.
The other book was written by an enslaved African man brought to America during Jefferson's presidency.
On this first page, that's Quran, isn't it?
It is. Omar ibn Said was a teacher of Islam before he was sold into slavery.
Together, these two books represent the promise and contradictions of America, where some Muslims were included in ideas of religious freedom, championed by the nation's founders, while others were denied all their rights, including the right to practice their religion. Thomas Jefferson is well known as the author of the Declaration of Independence and for serving as the third president of the United States. He's less well known for owning a copy of the Quran. That began to change in 2007 when Keith Ellison, the first Muslim elected to Congress, swore his private oath of office on Jefferson's copy of the Quran.
People didn't know that Jefferson owned a Quran and had it as an important part of his library, but the United States has always been a country with an Islamic presence. Never not. Never not.
Muslims are rarely mentioned in the story of the nation's founding. So I want to know more about why Jefferson owned a copy of the Quran and what it can tell us about the place of Muslims in early America.
The fact that Jefferson has a copy of the Al-Quran is a tribute to the power of Islam and Muslims in world history. This was one of the great texts of the world. In order to be an educated person, you had to know about the Quran.
Jefferson's fundamental curiosity would compel him to buy a Quran, to learn about Islam, to want to think about what Islamic philosophy would teach him about government.
These revolutionary leaders who became the head of government were great readers. And the British before them had, in fact, contact with Muslim kingdoms, such as the Ottoman Empire from the 16th century and North African kingdoms in the 17th century. So Americans inherited a transatlantic connection. Islam wasn't as foreign as many people would have thought it would have been at the time.
Sometimes we think about America and its relationship to the West and this kind of manifest destiny of pushing West, rather than the Atlantic world relationships that were essential at the end of the 18th century and through the 19th century. When we think about early America, the founders, it was a profoundly global moment.
My next stop is Jefferson's home in Central Virginia, a mansion that reflects the power and privilege of early America's white land-holding elite. This is where Jefferson kept a copy of his Quran before selling most of his books to the Library of Congress in 1815.
Amen.
Pleasure to meet you.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
How you doing?
Welcome to Monticello.
Thank you.
Historian John Ragosta has spent much of his career studying Jefferson, especially his attitude towards religion and its role in the early republic.
So, Eamon, welcome to Jefferson's study. This, before he sends all those books to the Library of Congress, this would have been lined with books. There would have been bookcases everywhere. He has 6,500 books that he sells to the Library of Congress. And of course, among them is his Quran. So people talk about the Jefferson Quran. Sometimes hear people say, well, he wanted to know his enemies.
Yeah.
It's completely ridiculous. He buys that Quran in 1765 when he's a student. He's interested in comparative religion. He's interested in law. He has a number of books on North African nations, on Muslim nations. They're probably over in that area of the library.
What does that say about Jefferson compared to some of his peers?
He's certainly more advanced than many people of his era in this regard. That through science, through our minds, the illimitable freedom of the human mind Jefferson talks about, we're going to improve. Each generation is going to learn from the last. And it's through study of things like the Quran and comparative religion, through studies of comparative laws, that's going to make us a better people. Let's go on into the parlor. Here on the wall, we see the great explorers, political leaders, scientists, and philosophers, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, and John Locke. John Locke, he actually has to flee England because religious disputes he's worried about his life at that point in time. He writes the Second Letter of Toleration, and Locke says we should be open politically to Jews and to Mohammedans, which is the term they would use for Muslims. Jefferson says we can go further than Locke. In America, all people can participate in religious freedom.
Jefferson's commitment to the idea that all citizens should be free to practice their religion as they choose can be seen in a bill he wrote for the Virginia State Legislature in 1777, a document that's thought to have shaped the religious clauses in the Bill of Rights. Some founders argued that the government should favor Protestant Christians over all other traditions, but Jefferson was clear. In his autobiography, he stated that his law included the Jew and the Gentile, the Christian and the Mohammedan, the Hindu and the infidel of every denomination. So at the very foundation of this country, there was one of the founding fathers imagining Muslim Americans.
Absolutely. He understands that's going to happen.
To think about Muslims as future citizens was a way of imagining a completely new nation that included more than just Christians, particularly Protestant Christians.
Bringing Muslims into the conversation, mentioning them in documents, there's some foreshadowing of the hopes and aspirations of what the country could become.
Where are we right now?
Well, we're actually coming up on Thomas Jefferson's grave site, which is down below the Monticello, the house. But this is where Jefferson is buried. And unlike most of us, Jefferson actually specifies what he wants on his tombstone. And he says, I want it to say, here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the American Declaration of Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. And then he writes, and not a word more.
To see religious freedom on the tombstone, that feels very significant.
This was America. This is the nation they were building. It's going to be built on political freedom, religious freedom, public education. And they're interrelated. It's a three-legged stool.
Jefferson's vision of America offered the possibility that any citizen of any faith could practice it freely. It opened the door for all citizens to participate politically, too.
And the fact that Jefferson held on to the image of Muslims as people who might one day not only have religious freedom but political equality is really the beginning, I think, of his political understanding of a future society that had a universal, inclusive precedence for the future.
Jefferson clearly thought about Muslims in theory. In practice, he had little contact. Documents from the time record just one meeting with a Muslim man here in the United States, which took place while Jefferson was president.
In 1805, the first Muslim ambassador to the United States arrived from Tunis. We were in the middle of an undeclared war that Thomas Jefferson had waged against Tripoli. Tunis was an ally of Tripoli. So the Tunisian ambassador was sent to negotiate with President Jefferson. He was dressed in finery of all sorts of brocade, gold, scarlet, and he had a diamond snuff box that was the talk of the town. Whereas a New Hampshire senator who was at this meeting said that Jefferson appeared scruffy by comparison. Jefferson received him at a state dinner that he set the time for at 3:30 in the afternoon.
Well, someone let it be known that Meli Meli is obviously Muslim and it's Ramadan. And Jefferson doesn't skip a beat. He says, okay, then dinner will begin precisely at sundown.
Which indicates that Jefferson learned from his Quran and from other books about what Muslims believe.
And Meli Meli arrives very shortly after sundown, and then they break bread and have an iftar dinner. This is often referred to as the first iftar dinner in the White House, and it's happening in Jefferson's presidency.
Jefferson's treatment of Meli Meli is revealing. Here was a man of power and influence from a part of the world the founders associated with Islam. This made him very different from the many Muslims already living here by this time.
The founders are thinking about Islam and they're thinking about Muslims, but they're thinking about the kind of great centers of Islamic learning and power in what we now call the Middle East. They're not thinking about Muslims who are in the new United States. Thousands upon thousands of enslaved African Muslims being shipped to the Americas.
Many of the places from which people were horrifically taken in West Africa were places impacted by Islam. And so the people who were brought to America, estimates range from thousands to tens of thousands, were Muslim.
There is evidence for the presence of enslaved African Muslims. You see it in runaway advertisements. You also see it in plantation records of slave names. We actually do have a few narratives that have been penned by African Muslims enslaved here, and some of them are written in Arabic.
There's no firm evidence of Muslim presence at Monticello. But this was a plantation where Jefferson, the person who wrote that all men are created equal, enslaved over 400 people over his lifetime.
You can actually see some of the fingerprints in the bricks. Enslaved children likely are forming these bricks. You know, here in the bricks, young children, when these bricks were formed 230 years ago. But it's a brutal system. And literally, they're the ones who are making the material that builds this mansion. You don't have Monticello at that time built like this without that enslaved labor that Jefferson is using. Enslaved people built this country.
As long as we're talking about the founding principles that established a nation based on freedom, then we have to be talking about slavery and the unfree. As long as we're talking about George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, we have to be talking about their slaves. Because any ideas they had about human freedom and how it would flourish, the conditions in which it would flourish, are immediately contradicted by the fact that they held slaves and that the United States becomes, by the mid-19th century, the largest slave society in modern history.
It's among these enslaved people, people with no rights of any kind, let alone the right to practice their religion, that a very different picture of Muslims in early America emerges. These Muslims weren't imaginary future citizens from far away. They were real people, right here, struggling to keep their faith and traditions alive, often in the most difficult circumstances. Evidence of at least 2 enslaved Muslims can be found on the plantation of another former president, George Washington.
Welcome to the library. This is a page from George Washington's tax list, they call tithables lists, from 1774. And this is the first document that shows a person with a Muslim name. Right in here you can see the name Fatima.
Yeah.
And under here is little Fatima.
That's the name of the prophet's
daughter.
This makes it very real for me.
The idea that there would have been a Fatima and a little Fatima That suggests strongly that there was a mother and daughter. A mother who had control over nothing in her life except the name she gave her child, who was also enslaved.
This is cash is being paid for the following Negroes: Abram, Oxford, Tom, Jack, Edie, Fatimore. All those people brought in 2,303 pounds and 19 shillings.
This is years before the Declaration of Independence, and here we have evidence that Muslims might have lived here. Do we know anything else about Fatima?
It gives you an idea of how hard, maybe in a family situation, it might be to pass on Islam in a family, because if they are a mother and daughter, they're being split up here.
I can't imagine if I would have been Muslim at all, had I been separated from my parents in this way. Washington's name is often associated with freedom. Freedom from the British, and religious freedom. He was committed to that idea too. Knowing he enslaved people here, some of them Muslim, is hard to take in. Back at the Library of Congress, I've come to see another way enslaved Muslims remained connected to their traditions. Not through their names, but in their writings. Like the book Jefferson owned, this one also contains verses from the Quran. But this book is very different. It was written here in America by an enslaved man brought to the United States in 1807.
This is the only known autobiography that we have written by an enslaved man in this country in Arabic. So it is short, small, tiny, but incredibly powerful in terms of what it can tell us about history.
Do we know anything about who wrote it?
Omar ibn Said was living in the Senegambia, in a little area called Fututoro. He was born in 1770, and he studied Islam and Arabic language and writing before he was taken from his hometown, made it through the Middle Passage, and landed in Charleston, South Carolina, where he was sold at auction.
In his book, Ibn Said tells a dramatic story how when his first enslaver mistreated him, he ran away. He made it to Fayetteville, North Carolina, before being captured and held in the local jail. Here, he came to the attention of the next man to enslave him, a politician, after he wrote in Arabic, probably verses from the Quran, on his jailhouse wall. This would have shocked the local residents, given the widespread belief that enslaved Africans had no written traditions. I know that this is introduced as an autobiography. I've heard it called that. But on this first page, that's Quran, isn't it?
It is.
The surah that he starts this autobiography with is Surah Al-Mulk, which talks about justice.
Yes.
And that to me just gives me chills.
He was attempting to tell the story of his enslavement, but also to capture a chapter of the Quran called Al-Mulk, which is known as the dominion or the sovereignty. Some scholars think that it was his way of protesting his enslavement. Muslims who were enslaved and had been educated in West Africa before their enslavement carried with them to the United States, learning about Islam, memorized passages of the Quran. And so the faith traveled with them, inside them.
One of the most famous examples of this is another enslaved person, Ibrahim Abdul Rahman, who was enslaved for 40 years in Mississippi, eventually receiving manumission, emancipation because of his Arabic literacy. And many of the manuscripts we have from him are people asking him to write something. One of the manuscripts that's now held in Philadelphia is one of the presumably white interlocutors asked him to write the Lord's Prayer. But instead of the Christian Lord's Prayer, Abdul Rahman writes the Fatiha, the first chapter of the Quran. Of course, it is the Lord's Prayer for Ibrahim Abdul Rahman.
Abdul Rahman was able to return to West Africa, but Omar was not so fortunate.
Omar ibn Said, despite however exalted he may have been as an enslaved African man, as an enslaved Muslim African man, he was never made free. He was never made free. This is a piece of history, a missing piece of history written by a man in his own hand, who not only survived the Middle Passage, who not only survived the plantation system, but lived to write about it. So this is American history at its finest, but it's also Senegalese history. It's also African history. It is also Islamic history. It is world history.
The presence of enslaved Muslims who could read and write did not escape Thomas Jefferson. Researchers recently found Arabic writings among his papers, documents written by 2 enslaved African Muslims who had run away and made it to western Kentucky. From there, they wrote letters in Arabic, asking for help. In 1807, these letters reached Jefferson at the White House.
And then the story unfolds of him trying to get these Arabic writings translated. But in the meantime, the 2 men who were taken captive escape. And Jefferson eventually receives updates. And then the last moment that we have any glimpse of where they are is Carthage, Tennessee.
For a moment, these men caught Jefferson's attention. He even considered advocating for their freedom because of their literacy, until the trail went cold.
And we don't know what happens after 1808 as Jefferson fails to translate them and their case is forgotten, and yet he keeps the papers.
Jefferson wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom in 1777. The Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791, but the idea of religious freedom for all Americans was a long time coming. States continued to restrict who could run for office by religion until the 1830s. It was not until 1947 that the Supreme Court ruled that states were also prohibited from establishing a religion. And the government restricted Native American spiritual practices until 1978, with access to some sacred sites still limited. For American Muslims, an important moment in this story came when Keith Ellison was elected to Congress against a backdrop of anti-Muslim sentiment. Here was a Muslim descended from enslaved people choosing to swear his private oath of office on the copy of the Quran that Jefferson once owned.
It was an amazing moment. I felt weight. I also felt light, like a feather. And I also felt the weight of a civilization.
It did make for some interesting TV moments when people were trying to argue that you had to swear in on a Bible.
Well, the funny thing is nobody has to swear in on anything. It's when the speaker says, do you swear to uphold the Constitution, defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic? I do, bam. After there's this ceremony, and it's common for people to use books. Debbie Wasserman Schultz brings out a copy of the Tanakh. Tulsi Gabbard brings the Bhagavad Gita, because she's Hindu. It opened up a tradition where people got to do this.
When Keith Ellison decides to get sworn in on Jefferson's Al-Quran, it's a way of saying, first of all, we've always been here. And second of all, we're writing a new chapter.
The story of Islam in America is also a story of how the idea of Muslims as future citizens brings us to the present day when we do have a population of Muslims whose citizenship is often perceived as suspect or foreign. There's nothing foreign about the practice of Islam in the United States.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله. الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله.
لا إله إلا الله. استقيموا واعتدلوا يرحمني ويرحمكم الله. Please finish the line here to have some space there. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله ولتنظر نفس ما قدمت لغد واتقوا الله إن الله خبير بما تعملون. ولا تكونوا كالذين نسوا الله فأنساهم أنفسهم أولئك هم الفاسقون. لا يستوي أصحاب النار وأصحاب الجنة أصحاب الجنة هم الفائزون. لو أنزلنا هذا القرآن على جبل لرأيته خاشعا متصدعا من خشية الله. وتلك الأمثال نضربها للناس لعلهم يتفكرون. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربنا. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو عالم الغيب والشهادة هو الرحمن الرحيم. هو الله الذي لا إله إلا هو الملك القدوس السلام المؤمن المهيمن العزيز الجبار المتكبر سبحان الله عما يشركون. هو الله الخالق البارئ المصور له الأسماء الحسنى يسبح له ما في السماوات والأرض وهو العزيز الحكيم. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. استغفر الله استغفر الله العظيم لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم. استغفر الله العظيم الذي لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم وأتوب إليه. اللهم آمين.
Assalamu alaikum. So if you haven't had dinner, there are dinner boxes for Murchi for sale in the lobby. We do have family night tonight. We're watching this PBS documentary about the life of early Muslims in America. We just finished Thomas Jefferson's Quran. Now we'll be looking at Muslims' involvement in the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation Act. We'll go all the way to 9 o'clock and see how many videos we can watch, inshallah. We'll also have a discussion afterwards. Jazakallah khair. We'll start shortly after Sunnah. Okay, those that are here for the family night, we're going to be restarting. So if you want to come back to your seat, inshallah, we'll be starting the next one about Muslims during the Civil War. Jazakallah khair. Oh no, I already. Yeah. No, but there's no more time. It's finished at 9. Yeah. No, we'll go a little bit longer. There's people watching online. Okay, we're going to get started, inshallah, with the next one. This is about fighting for freedom, the little-known story of Muslims and the Civil War.
Described in his military records, recently discovered in the National Archives in Washington, D.C.
I've pulled tens of thousands of files over the years. This is probably the only, if not...
Abraham Lincoln came to Gettysburg and delivered his most famous speech. In 2 powerful minutes, he spelled out the meaning behind the sacrifices the war demanded.
Lincoln put it all together in the Gettysburg Address. It went down right to the core values of the founding of the nation, that all men are created equal.
The Civil War, it was supposed to have decided the fundamental question at the heart of what America was going to be: guarantee life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all citizens of the United States.
Some people might think of the Civil War as a war brother against brother, North and South, but it also had a more global perspective. That had to do with humanity.
As a Muslim, I want to know, could it be that people who shared my faith helped bring about this new birth of freedom? That Muslims fought to end slavery too? That's where Private Muhammad Khan comes in. He's part of a story researchers are still piecing together. The details of Khan's eventful life are revealed bit by bit in his application for a pension, 200 pages long. Because of it, we know more about his service than most other soldiers who fought in the conflict. So this is someone interviewing him to determine if he would receive his pension?
A series of interviews over many years. They couldn't understand his pronunciation of Muhammad Khan when he enlisted. So they wrote the best they could. And Amihi's the best they could come up with for Muhammad. And they would just pretty much named everyone John if they had no, like John Doe.
What can you tell us about his religion, his faith, his Muslim identity?
They don't typically express a soldier's faith in one of these records. But when he's getting testimony from different apothecaries and sort of pharmacists that he was buying medicine from, that one of them says he used to come into my store and I would read to him what he called the Mohammedan Bible, or what they call the Quran, but misspelled in the document, spelled with an H. There's the key right there. It's very clear what his faith was.
So this man had long black hair, and this witness, from his looks, manners, and general appearance, supposed him to be an American Indian.
I was born in Persia and raised in Afghanistan. I came to this country in 1861 with an American officer, a consul, but I don't remember his name. I couldn't speak one word of English at that time. About 2 or 2.5 months after my arrival, I enlisted at New Haven, Connecticut, having been persuaded to enlist while under the influence of liquor.
What a story.
Not unusual.
Were recruiters using alcohol to recruit people?
Yes, and drugs.
Wow.
I came across many stories, complaints by soldiers who are claiming that these recruiters, runners they called them, would treat them to drinks at the tavern, and that they were recruited and enlisted against their will. There was no question there was some of that went on.
Whatever led Khan to enlist, he wasn't the only immigrant to join the Union forces.
There are 2.2 million soldiers that serve in the Union Army over the 4 years, and about 1/4 of those were born in a foreign country.
Most of these men came from Europe, but migrants had begun arriving from parts of Asia too.
I remember coming across evidence of a soldier who died at Gettysburg. They called him John Tommy. He was a Chinese soldier. He died for his adopted country. So is it a surprise to find Muslims in this war? I was delighted to find this and not entirely surprised.
More evidence for Muslims in the Union Army can be found in the United States colored troops, regiments made up mainly of Black Americans, many of them formerly enslaved people. Established in 1863, the colored troops and their supporters wanted to expand the Union's goals. They wanted to end slavery.
I am the full-time historical interpreter. My job here is to share the truth and not history about this lost story about 209,145 men that answer a government's cry for help.
The names of every single colored soldier etched into this wall?
Yes, all who have served, including the soldiers from the West Indies, South America, folks of Asian descent. So the rule was if you were non-white, they're going to put you in the Bureau of United States Colored Soldiers. The whole world was in this rebellion.
Given Muhammad Khan's appearance, You might expect to find his name on this memorial, but it's not here. Instead, I find the name of the best-known Black Muslim in the Union Army, an African immigrant named Nicholas Muhammad Ali bin Said.
Nicholas Said walked into the United States a free man before the Civil War started. He was from the Kingdom of Borno, that area that is now northern Nigeria. He arrived in 1860, joined up with the 55th Regiment, and he said, because all my people seem to be doing so.
Said is an unusual recruit. Whoever's in charge of the unit notices how well educated he is, and so he becomes a clerk rather than a frontline fighter.
And he's this really interesting figure because he's also literate, right? He writes his autobiography.
He writes about his whole life and also about the conditions of Reconstruction. Interestingly, he doesn't mention his military service, probably because being in the South, he doesn't want to be associated with the Union Army.
He actually receives this rank as sergeant.
This is a remarkable man.
Muslim presence in the Civil War that he represents, I think is very important. This is not a foreign story. It's a part of the American story.
Alongside Nicholas Said, that story now includes Muhammad Khan, whose name is not on this wall for a simple reason. He was part of an all-white unit, the 43rd New York Infantry.
How was he able to join the 43rd in the first place, though, looking as he did?
He was recruited by his captain, and no one seemed to question it. He was getting full pay, full benefits, if there were any, of a white soldier at the time, so.
With Khan in their ranks, the New York 43rd marched south through Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. Sometimes Khan was allowed to fight. Other times, he was given more menial duties.
It's possible that he was mistreated because of his color, but also expected to march in line and do duty like a white man.
In July of 1863, the 43rd reached Gettysburg, the best-known battle of the Civil War, and perhaps its turning point. We know Khan was nearby, while some of his comrades fought in close combat.
The 43rd New York and the 7th Maine was the two regiments who formed a line of battle down over the field, and they charged up over the hill. The Confederates were behind that very stone fence in that woods.
Wow, so close.
And they pushed the Confederates back.
43rd New York Infantry held this position from the morning of July 3rd until the close of battle.
The 43rd was a very, very hard fighting regiment, and they fought in just about every major battle of the Army of the Potomac. Here at Gettysburg, 5 casualties in the 43rd, 2 of them killed outright, 11 wounded, 4 of them mortally, and 1 captured.
So you can't get into his head, but you have seen so many documents. Why do you think Muhammad Khan
would fight in the war?
He knew how to be a soldier. He said he knew how to load and fire a musket and quickly was in the ranks marching and doing his duty.
He may have felt tricked into enlisting, but he stayed and he fought. That was a common path to citizenship and to national identity.
This is someone who could have been obscure, could have just come here and maybe lived some years, gone back maybe. This is a man who agreed to be right in the thick of the fight. Once he got in it, I think he understood the stakes, and he went for it.
He could have run away or really escaped at any time. He did stick around for some reason, and it may have been because he felt morally and ethically obligated to see it through.
As a Muslim, Khan may have been inspired by traditional Islamic teachings about slavery. These urged Muslims to treat enslaved people with dignity and work for their freedom. At the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, there's evidence that Muslim attempts to end slavery in the U.S. extended well beyond our shores. Logs from the American consulate in Tunis, North Africa, date back to 1864. They contain the translation of a letter from a prominent Tunisian official, Major General Hussein. Tunis, an autonomous province of the Ottoman Empire, had abolished slavery some 20 years earlier, citing the moral principles of Islam. In this letter, Major General Hussein urged Americans to end slavery too.
O inhabitants of America, since God has permitted you to enjoy full personal liberty and to manage your civil and political affairs yourselves, while many other people are deprived of such distinguished privileges and blessings, it would not tarnish the luster of your crown to grant to your slaves, as an act of gratitude for the favors God has bestowed on you, such civil rights as are not denied to the humblest and meanest of your citizens. Humanity invites you to eradicate from your Constitution all that can give countenance to the principle of slavery. Strong words.
Very powerful words.
We look at the letter from Hussein Pasha. He doesn't mention white and black. He mentions the human being. He references the Quran and the experiences of Muslims with slavery.
He was upholding these ideas of liberty and emancipation that I think most of us think are kind of the intellectual property of the West.
When the American consul in Tunis received General Hussein's letter, he sent it to the Secretary of State in Washington, D.C. He also sent a copy to a leading advocate for abolition, Senator Charles Sumner.
He's helping give ammunition to Sumner in his fight for abolition in the United States.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's reflected in when he says, you will have strong support to the principles which you have for years set forth and defended. This is clearly something that he believes Sumner can use to his advantage in arguing against slavery.
Sumner was grateful to Major General Hussein, according to the American consul's papers. That's not surprising. Here in the U.S. Capitol, Sumner was known for referring to Islam in his arguments for abolition, especially in his famous Barbarism of Slavery speech from 1860. In it, Sumner criticized Southern slaveholders, contrasting their treatment of enslaved people with traditional Islamic approaches.
He was quoting the Quran to the level that this was actually reported in the New York Times. The speech was published in full.
As diplomats and politicians waged their war of words, the conflict continued on the battlefield. For Muhammad Khan, this meant more fighting, and not just against Confederate forces. A few days after Gettysburg, Khan found himself in nearby Hagerstown, where, based on his appearance, a group of Union soldiers mistook him for a runaway slave.
Just as I was going up the hill towards the railroad depot, I was arrested by a guard and taken to the provost marshal's headquarters, where there were a large number of colored men. This guard arrested all black men they met. I said that I was a regularly enlisted soldier of the 43rd New York and asked to be sent to my regiment. This I explained to them as well as I could in my broken English, but they wouldn't believe me.
They said he was a contraband slave, meaning that he was an escaped slave, that he was not eligible for service and that he was lying, so they arrested him.
Khan was sent to a contraband camp in Philadelphia, one of many such camps set up to house formerly enslaved people fleeing the South. But this couldn't keep him from the front line.
He spends months there in Philadelphia trying to find his company, right? Looking for his fellow soldiers.
At the time, news came about the fighting in the wilderness. I was around the railroad depot. As I was very anxious to join my company, I jumped aboard a train just as it started and went with it without asking permission of anyone to get aboard. I landed in Washington.
He gets off the train and he kind of walks with other squadrons from DC to Virginia. And finally, he finds his company.
His company was engaged in brutal fighting, waged across Virginia's Spotsylvania County. Khan would not survive unscathed here for long.
One U.S. Army regular soldier describes this as a battle of invisibles with invisibles. Snarled, ugly, scrubby, bushy mess. Black powder smoke could completely obscure a battlefield even when it's entirely in the open. Fighting in dense forage like this makes it almost impossible to see at all. Not only do you not know where the enemy is half the time, a lot of times you don't know where you are.
So it sounds like heavy casualties.
Heavy casualties.
I had picked up a rifle, and I went straight to my company and fell into line. 10 or 15 minutes after this, my regiment made a charge. Almost immediately, I was shot, wounded in the left hand.
Given everything you said, it's really not surprising that Muhammad Khan would have been injured here.
No, it's not surprising he was injured here at all. And it's borderline miraculous that he wasn't killed.
Still, Khan's wound was so severe that he spent several months recuperating at a military hospital. But in early 1865, Muhammad Khan rejoined his regiment again. He fought alongside his comrades as a sharpshooter until the end of the war. That came in April of 1865, and with it, rapid change, despite Lincoln's assassination.
I think that Reconstruction was actually a huge achievement. I mean, first of all, it was total. It was immediate. And it very quickly passed 3 major constitutional amendments.
13th Amendment abolishes slavery. The 14th guarantees equal protection under law for all, and the 15th guarantees voting rights for men, regardless of national origin. The writing of the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments really intended to solve the problems at the heart of America. It didn't turn out that way.
For Muhammad Khan, the war was over, but a new challenge had begun: to rebuild his life as a civilian. By this time, his wife had arrived from South Asia, and Khan tried to make a living as a peddler, selling beads, baskets, and herbal medicine. All the while, he struggled with the wounds he received in the war and fought for his rights as a veteran, too.
Is it typical to struggle to get your pension?
Yes. So they required either direct evidence, documentation, that you had served and were wounded and deserved a pension, or were sick and deserved a pension, or you needed a lot of testimony. He could produce neither. He went through a lot of hassle getting this one. So he talked to the pension office, talked to congressmen. He lived in the District of Columbia, so he was in the halls of Congress, knocking on doors, asking for favors, getting assistance. He was what they would consider a great pest, in the sense that he was there all the time. Everyone knew him. They did all kinds of favors trying to get records for him. They contacted the Secretary of War eventually. And they loaned him money. A lot of black soldiers from the Civil War did work in the pension office. And that's who he actually borrowed money from when he would come to these offices. They really felt for him. You know, they knew his struggle was genuine.
Do you think his race factored into his struggle to get his pension?
Absolutely. He received a lot more pushback and had to enlist the help of all these powerful people to assist him.
Khan fought for over 20 years to receive the pension he was due. But the laborious process generated the paperwork that allows us to reconstruct his story. The pages became his history. When he died in 1891, Khan was buried in Cypress Hills National Cemetery, Brooklyn, under the name the Army gave him, not his own. Here he lies among 4,000 other Civil War veterans, white soldiers, and members of the U.S. colored troops.
I'm getting goosebumps knowing that we're close. 5009. There it is. John Amahai, New York. We found it.
We'll never be completely sure what Muhammad Khan was fighting for. What we do know is that somehow he made the war that ended slavery his own war. A war that advanced the cause of freedom then and continues to shape the nation we're becoming now.